church lawn. And yes, thank you. Good. Um, we're talking about discovering the spirituality, culture, and practice of urban garden. It's a very interesting combination of features. I'm Derwin Sangster, as most of you know, and I coordinate the St. Thomas, the Apostle Garden, and I'll be moderating our session. But I will, in fact, be watching our two main presenters, who will be sort of doing, if you will, the heavy lifting. We're obviously, as most of us know, the garden is located on the front lawn of St. Thomas the Apostle. And that, of course, is the lawn that's mentioned in our title. And for that reason, that lawn and that land, I think it's particularly appropriate to begin by acknowledging that garden and that lawn, and indeed this Ottawa land, is on traditional Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And may we dwell on this land with respect and peace. Our two main speakers, as you'll obviously have read in our poster, are Reverend Tom Hubschmidt, the Assistant Curate at St. Thomas the Apostle Church, and one of our community garden volunteers, and Dr. Jeff Hoyle, retired professor of the Faculty of Agriculture at Dalhousie University, and another one of our St. Thomas Community Garden volunteers. And Tom will talk about the scriptural basis of a more earthly Christian spirituality, as well as urban agriculture and community gardens as a place of connection. And Jeff will talk about suggestions for a successful gardening season, including soil care, succession planting, and cover crops, and so forth. In just a minute, we'll actually begin, and Tom and Jeff will actually introduce one another, and then Tom will lead off. They will take turns in making their share of presentations, and at those changeovers, we will stop for a few minutes and allow some time if anybody has any questions. And if you have questions, you're certainly welcome to raise them either using the kind of raise hand function that is part of the Zoom panoply of services, or you can type your question in the chat function of the Zoom. I think we're probably all familiar with those two approaches. We've got a group that's small enough that if somebody just decides they're going to raise their hand and ask a question, we've got essentially one screen, and that will work too. So there's a number of different ways to ask questions as we go forward, alternating between Tom and Jeff. So without further ado, and as you know, the session is being recorded and will be available in due course on the St. Thomas the Apostle YouTube site as part of which is accessible on the St. Thomas website. So I think we're starting here with Tom introducing Jeff, and then vice versa, if I've got it right. So Tom, can I pass the microphone, as it were, to you?
You bet. Thanks, Derwin. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Jeff is a retired faculty member from Dalhousie University's Faculty of Agriculture, which is in Truro, Nova Scotia. During his career, Jeff researched compost, potatoes, strawberries, leeks, and cut flowers. With his wife, Diane, he owned a small mixed farm in rural Nova Scotia for more than 10 years, and really enjoyed incorporating chickens, ducks, and geese into the operation. Jeff is a lifelong gardener, having started at the early age of 5 years old in his grandfather's very large British garden. Jeff, thanks for joining us and preparing some garden lessons for us.
Thank you, Tom. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tom, who's a new priest in the Diocese of Ottawa at St. Thomas the Apostle Parish. He's a PhD candidate in theological studies at the University of Toronto. He and his wife, Tanya, live in Ottawa, and he originates from farming country in Alberta, which is a big country. I just got back from Edmonton. He's new to gardening, having discovered an interest through the essays of Wendell Berry, very famous writer from southern US, and various documentaries on small-scale farming. And if I could just also add that it's really nice to be now part of this community. I'm seeing people that I don't know, and I'm hoping that you will become friends. And also like to just make a final comment that Tom and I have already found common interests, and I think a common purpose in many ways, partly with this presentation, but other things. We're much more alike than I ever thought, Tom, and I'm really pleased that you're involved in this and that I'm involved too. So thank you very much.
Excellent.
Just to throw in an aside, we could spend the rest of this session talking about how community gardens build community. There is one example, but we won't. We can think about that later. And at the risk of intruding, I think we're now moving over to Tom for his initial comments. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Derwin. And I'll just add that in our question time, if there are just comments or things to share, I think that would be worthwhile too. Just to kind of build off stuff that Jeff was saying. So let me share my screen here. Okay, all can see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I'm talking about Christian spirituality and the scriptural basis for what I'm calling a more earthy spirituality. And Christian spirituality isn't as known for its connection to the earth as it should be. There's a complicated history at work, but it's resulted in a lot of negativity toward the earth and our bodies. But even within sound Christian teaching, talk about creation is often tended to emphasize the fallenness of the earth. That is to focus on what John Milton, the poet, called paradise lost. And teaching about fallenness is meant to clarify what it is about life on earth that warranted this whole divine plan we call the gospel.
It's the one from the church.
And there's nothing wrong about teaching about fallenness, except when that's all we get. When Christian teaching really starts from the start, with first things first, then our view of the created world is that it's the
Oh, you
place.
sure you want me to look?
I'll
have a look.
Maybe we could,
Okay,
I might be able
thank
to
you. Bye.
mute that.
Maybe you should mute all of us, Daryl, except for Tom.
I might be able to mute. Okay, I'm just going through the windows here and muting. Mute. Okay. Now. Okay, sorry for the interruption there. What I was saying is that there's nothing wrong with this talk of fallenness, but it misses the point sometimes if it doesn't talk about the created goodness of the earth. And teaching that creation is the place God created or made for fellowship between creatures, and all as a universal communion with God, the Creator. And so what I'm going to do now is simply look at Bible verses that help show what kind of positive beliefs Christians are meant to have about creation. And I can only really skim the surface here, but consider writing down by the scripture references that I have on the side of my slides if you'd like to do more looking and reading yourself. So, like I said, first things first, Genesis 1. It's probably one of the most famous passages, so you know it. But in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God called, "Let there be light," and God saw that it was good. Land and sea, and God saw that it was good. Vegetation, God saw that it was good. Sun, moon, stars, good. Sea and sky creatures, good. And then animals of the earth, including human beings made on the same day as other animals, also good, and indeed very good. And this is all the starting place for Jewish and Christian teaching. It's a creation myth that protests against certain ancient creation myths that viewed creation as inherently violent. And it still flies in the face of worldviews that see creation as nothing more than a collection of resources. But Genesis 1 means that coming to know God and learning to be ourselves involves learning to live like life on earth is a gift for fellowship and not a battle for riches. So there's some more verses in the Psalms and Proverbs that we get a sense for the goodness of creation. But then there's us. Genesis 2 gets to the creation, the forming of Adam. Then the Lord formed man from the dust of the ground. And Adam is the name given to the man that is a gender neutral name, including both men and women. But interestingly enough, the name refers, or it means earth creature. Or as I like to say, earthling. The earthling, or the Adam, wasn't created out of thin air, but rather molded out of the earth. And I think that the literal interpretation of this is simply that that the human being belongs here, not some other spiritual realm, but we are made from and for this earth. And lastly, creation as a whole, the Bible teaches, is praising God. So Psalm 19, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Verse 3, there's no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth. Psalms like this teach that the whole of creation is a responsive prayer to God. God says, "Let there be," and all of creation is a constant event of things hiddenly and explicitly responding, "Here I am." The original nature of any creature is to come into existence and to go on living as an act of praise to God. And it's by an act of faith and prayer that we can learn to listen to the natural world and observe our human lives as an ongoing responsive prayer. Some more Psalms there on the side, but all this amounts to saying that life on earth is fundamentally good, and it's where God meets us. So getting our hands dirty with soil and plants and compost is all then one appropriate way to experience the earth and our creaturehood as the very means that our Creator uses to meet us. So I'll hand it over to Jeff, and he'll give us some practical instruction on all this gardening stuff.
So, sorry, first of all, I'll just unmute myself.
So I've made you host, and you should be able to share screen now.
Yeah, thank you. I could just get rid of all of there we go. All the little windows and things. Let's start. Okay.
Looks great.
So thank you very much, Tom, for that brief first part, and I know that you've got 2 more parts. I'm certainly looking forward to those. Welcome everyone. I've spent about 30 plus years of my life looking at the science of agriculture, but there's more than science to most things, and I also consider there to be an art. So there's an art and a science in agriculture, and gardening too. Gardening is a different form of the practice of agriculture. It's a very personal form in many ways. Over the 30 years or so, there have been many philosophies of agriculture. Some have come and gone, some have stuck around. And you're probably all familiar with the idea of organic agriculture, of sustainable agriculture, and perhaps not as familiar, but there is another buzzword, if you like, regenerative agriculture. My approach these days is more of a regenerative one. In that approach, one normally takes a very special note and takes very great care of the soil. But along with that, there's a understanding that the body and the mind are involved in this process. So, you do things to try and enrich your body and your mind and those of others as well. And we're all these days worried about the environment and maybe our planet and so on. And that's certainly part of regenerative agriculture and regenerative gardening as well. In addition to that, we need to incorporate diversity, and diversity will help the environment, the planet, us, and the soil as well. It's, I guess, at these days a watchword, but something that we need to be concerned about and continually watching. So I'm going to start by talking about the soil, and less about plants, which perhaps might seem a little odd to some of you, but I will talk a little about plants later on. So when we're looking at the soil, we're often, sorry, I just have to admit someone here. We have to look at how do we prepare the soil, and that's normally known as the tillage or tillage of the soil. So I'll talk about that a little bit. Then how do we feed the soil? So after preparing it in some way, then we need to nourish it so that the plants can grow. And then I'll look at the diversity of soil. And then I'm going to make some important comments about covering the soil as well. So tillage. There are many different approaches to tillage. In the old days, everyone used to dig. Then they started to rototill. And now, for the most part, there's the idea that no-till is important. So digging can be done by many different routes, many different ways. Those would include just simply digging or double digging, and I'm guessing that one of our attendees very much likes that idea, and it's certainly an approach. You can also fork the ground, which is much less damaging to the structure. But all of these methods, digging, double digging, and forking, are, to say the least, time. They take a lot of time and quite a significant amount of effort. When we follow these practices, what we see is, from a scientific point of view, that we get weeds for 7 to 10 years. And what we're doing when we're digging, we're unearthing weeds that have been set down as seeds when the weeds themselves went to seed many years ago, perhaps, or maybe as recently as this year. 7 to 10 years. If we can avoid unearthing that life, bring it back to the top of the surface, then we can save ourselves a lot of time. Rototilling, which of course requires a mechanical machine or machine, disturbs the soil structure, the soil profile a lot more than digging. It's quite damaging to even some of the soil organisms. But although people speak about that, there are probably not that many worms that are cut up. But it really digs up more and more of the weed seeds and brings them to the top of the surface all at once after the soil has been rototilled. And these two methods should be contrasted with no-till, which is much more, even in agriculture, so gardening and in agriculture, a much more common method of tillage now, where we maintain the structure of the soil, and that helps the soil organisms, and that helps things grow, and it certainly doesn't bring weeds to the surface. And I'll comment on that again as we go on. So I said that I'd talk a little bit about feeding the soil. And in fact, these days in agriculture, and so this is slowly coming through to gardening as well, we don't really think as much about feeding the plants. We think more about feeding the soil, and then the soil will feed the plants, or the soil organisms will feed the plants. So we all know plants need nutrients, and there are 3, 5, I've listed 4 of them there, relatively major nutrients, and there are many trace elements as well. And there are 2 methods of adding those nutrients. One is by synthetic fertilizer, and this is quite a direct method of feeding plants, but that's gone out of style. Certainly in gardens, certainly in the St. Thomas gardens, in Kilbourne, it's very much frowned upon to use synthetic fertilizer because there are other methods that are used. We might use blood meal, we might use bone meal, and so on. And so actually we're using the second method of providing nutrients, which is feeding the soil, feeding the microorganisms. Those then convert the materials that are in, let's say, blood meal, into something that plants can use. So they convert the nitrogen that's in blood meal into nitrate. They convert the potassium or the phosphate that's in bone meal into phosphate and potassium that are needed by plants. So feeding the soil is key. It's a really important idea. We're not feeding the plants, we're feeding the organisms. Even when you feed the soil by using manure or compost, and certainly, again, we do that at St. Thomas Garden, we're providing food that first of all goes through worms, so worms use it, they then excrete it, then that is picked up by biologically very small organisms, so fungi, and by bacteria, and they convert the material that came out at the end of the worm into nitrate, phosphate, potassium, trace elements, and so on. And so we're really concerned about the diversity of, or we should be concerned about the diversity of the land of our gardens. We should be concerned about building the number of microbes, microorganisms, bacteria and fungi, and also larger organisms like worms. We're also, of course, concerned with plants. And growing plants used to be about monoculture. Certainly in large farmers' fields, we were talking about monoculture, but even in gardens, the way that we grew plants was grew them in lines. We grew lots of a certain type of material together, and we really didn't mix them. These days, and when I go around the gardens, I see this, at St. Thomas and at Kilbourne as well. People are beginning to, or perhaps some have even been doing it for quite a long time, are beginning to spread the diversity, increase the diversity. They're growing cover crops, they're growing companion plants, and they're growing many different types of crop plants as well. We need to keep the soil covered, and on farms that's actually relatively easy. Once fields have plants that have grown, a reasonable way along their life cycle. So as we see here, the pictures of wheat and of tulips and cole crops. Most of the soil is covered. It's quite easy to maintain that. There's very little weed pressure when you're growing something that is growing this close together. At least when we're close to harvest anyway, but even before that as well. Sometimes I think farmers still use selective herbicides to get to this level of control, but we're long since away from the days when the herbicides were used on a very large scale basis. At the garden level, it's much more difficult to do this. And if you grow plants, and particularly if you grow plants at the spacing that is mentioned on the back of seed packages, then there's relatively lots of soil that's exposed. And that causes a lot of problems. It causes certainly weed pressure. It causes us to have to water plants very often. And so really now I would encourage you, and certainly this method of looking at gardening as well as agriculture, I would encourage you to use mulch. On a large scale, you don't need it, but on a smaller scale, on our garden scale, you certainly do. And if you look at these 4 pictures on the right-hand side, they depict at least some of the mulches that can be used. So the top left is wood chips. The top right is leaves that have been left to form leaf mold. Usually if you do that, it's better if you put them through a lawnmower or some type of shredding device, and then leave them for a while. And that sample there certainly has had that. The lower left-hand side is pine needles. And a lot of people shy away from pine needles. They think that they're acidic. There are lots of people online, YouTube videos and so on, that tell you shouldn't use them. But really, these are an excellent mulch. And then on the right-hand side, I'm not sure what the material is that has been chopped and dropped, as they say. But really, that could be anything. So at Kilbourne Gardens, for example, quite a few people use the comfrey that's growing wild. But you could use nettles. You can certainly use grass clippings. You can use weeds that you pull out of your garden for the most part, as long as they don't have the roots associated with what you're dropping there. You could use green leaves off trees. Really, anything that covers the soil is good as mulch. And the words in the middle there give you some reason, perhaps, to use mulch. So if you use 2 to 3 inches of mulch, it holds water in. It keeps the soil cooler, particularly in very hot weather. It forms a barrier to seeds. So seeds dropping from wherever will not get through to the soil, so cannot germinate. Plus, it also suppresses weeds. So weed seeds that are underneath don't get light, and so they tend not to grow. Certainly, they have a much harder time growing. The things that I've mentioned are usually free. Some people you can buy pine needles, for example. But my advice would be use the things that are free. And then obviously chopping and dropping any type of plant material. Obviously you don't bring that in, you use whatever you have. These materials also improve the soil by adding nutrients as they break down, and they help with biodiversity as well. Sorry. Yeah. In addition to covering with mulches, you should certainly think about covering the soil with plants that you're growing. And so here are 4 photographs, examples of that. So the top left is actually an experiment I did at the garden at St. Thomas, where we planted, I think that is buckwheat. It was relatively later on in the season, and certainly is not great coverage, but it's something that I think is worthwhile. Buckwheat grows up to about 3 feet tall and is a great way of adding organic matter to the soil. The picture on the top right is some type of radish, and radishes are often used to grow and then left to rot. That's if you can afford the space, that's a great thing to do, because what it does is form channels in the ground where water can run through, and where soil microorganisms can start to move easier than having to eat through or run through the soil profile. The bottom left-hand corner is actually a picture that I took from my garden last summer, and actually there you see 2 crops together. So it's sort of an interplanting with Swiss chard on the top of the photograph, and there's actually cucumber growing through it. So there's a yellow type of cucumber there as well. So it is possible to grow multiple things very close together and to effectively mulch the ground by just growing materials that you can actually harvest and eat. On the right-hand side, I just make a couple of comments there, mention the words chop and drop. Nitrogen fixers are often grown, so peas, fava beans, clover, and then they usually incorporated into the soil or chopped and dropped on the top, and that adds to the nitrogen that most gardens are short of. Most gardens need nitrogen in one way or another. And grasses are often used as well. The problem with those is that it's difficult to kill them. And certainly on a small scale, on scale of gardening, it is relatively difficult to get rid of them. All of these comments are hopefully useful to you, but everyone knows how to grow things. Anyone can grow things with a packet of seeds and somewhere to sow them. So what I always say is, if all else fails, after you've prepared your soil, plant something, take notes, make sure you know what you've done, see what happens, think about what happened, improve it, and then repeat season after season after season. Compare notes with other people. That's probably the way that you'll learn as well. So I'll finish there, and I'm passing back to you, Tom. So stop sharing. Yeah.
I think
I pass the host back to you as well.
Derwin, should we invite some questions at this point? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm saying, if you have questions, as we mentioned at the outset, if you'd like to take them into the chat function, or simply raise your hands, or use the sort of hand raise function within the method, it's fine. I see Karen, I think, has a question. Karen, if you'd like to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yes, I'm listening to all this, and as you guys know, I love gardening. I was raised on a farm. It was a dairy farm. We didn't have very many crops, but we had a beautiful garden. And I'm thinking, like 60 years ago, what did our parents do to have beautiful gardens as far as vegetables and flowers and that? Like,
So
this, I mean, I know times have changed over 60 years, 70 years and that, but it sounds very complicated. I mean, when I garden, I just garden because that's how I was brought up, raised, just, you know, do the best you can type thing and forget about all the everything else you put into it. So it just makes me wonder, like, what did our parents do to have
So-
beautiful gardens?
I mean, obviously, I can't, Karen, I can't tell you exactly what your parents did, but I can tell you what, you know, others did in that time. So 60 years ago was after the war, the Second World War, and at that time, industry was looking for something to do with the material they made explosives out of, and so they made fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer. Ammonium nitrate, for example. Ammonium nitrate actually is a very good explosive, but it's also a good fertilizer as well. So they use that. They typically would have used raw manure on their fields.
Okay, cow manure, okay.
Yeah, cow manure or whatever animals they had. So yeah, in your case, you would have seen that. So those materials sometimes are not good, and certainly there have been instances over the years when they're not so good. But in many cases, they provide nitrogen, particularly if you wait a short period of time, and then plants flourish. And I mentioned that nitrogen is usually the material, the nutrient that is deficient. In those days, it was probably a little more phosphate deficiency, but those types of practices of adding synthetic fertilizer and manures have actually meant that many of our fields are now like very high in phosphate, in phosphorus. And I believe that, for example, Kilbourne Gardens, the allotments there, also used to be a farmer's field, and I think we're still experiencing the high phosphorus from those days of farming in that location. So I think times were different. I think these days we're more concerned about the way that, you know, we deal with the environment, the way that we interact with the environment, and yeah, I think there are many who would still like to use synthetic fertilizers, but I don't think that's much of a choice anymore.
Okay. I'm just curious because I just remember having this beautiful garden my mom and dad had,
Yep.
and whatever they put on it, yeah, probably cow manure.
Yep.
But things grew, and it just seemed simpler than what all this technology that you're.
Yes, no, I
I
understand.
don't put cow manure on the church garden when I during.
Huh. You might smell it. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Karen. That interesting question. If there's no other questions, I can't see it. Oh, Wayne has a question. Do you want to unmute yourself?
And you have to hit
Yeah.
there. Okay, yeah, my question is, we've been buying this lettuce lately, and it's called hydroponic. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how that's grown. It's been well priced. It's been really good. It stays fresh quite a while. I was just wondering, is there a lot of effort going into this kind of, I guess, growing hydroponic crops, or is it kind of pretty minimal?
No, so the idea of hydroponics is that instead of soil, you use water with the nutrients dissolved in it. And it's basically year round. So, you know, you can do it in the dead of winter as long as you have a space that's warm and has the right amount of light. There are places where they actually grow fish in ponds that they recycle that water that they use for hydroponics as well. So you can even get hydroponically raised fish or fish that are raised on the hydroponic wastes. So I think it's much more common these days. I just came back from a 3-month trip to Ecuador, and in fact, they raise hydroponic lettuce there, although it's so easy to grow lettuce. I guess it's becoming an easy thing to do these days. The technology is well developed, and yeah, it's cheap for sure.
Good. Okay. Janet Mark Wallace has raised a question in the chat room, which is, Jeff, I'll read it. If we were to use some of the oak leaves, the many oak leaves at St. Thomas as a mulch, do you think they need time to break down first? Should we use them mixed in with other compost or use them straight? And as she reminds us, there's a whole ton of them.
So my advice with any one species of leaf would be you should mix it with others. So there's lots of maple leaves around as well. The one that I perhaps would tend to avoid would be walnut leaves. But if you have a sort of a mixed bag of leaves, you can put them through a shredder or through lawnmower, and then put them on the surface. Don't mix them in with the soil. If you mix them in with the soil, then they'll tie up nitrogen for quite a long time. If you just put them on the surface of the soil, then the microorganisms, the worms will contact them just at the surface. And so there won't be this, basically the removal of nitrogen that would be available for plants. So over time, just keep doing it. Don't mix it in. Yeah, mix the leaves together with other types of leaves first.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Okay. I'm thinking we would want to move on now. Back to Tom. Thanks for those questions. Tom, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Great questions, everyone. And thanks, Jeff, for all this great work so far. So there's social benefits and economic benefits and environmental benefits to community gardening. Urban agriculture has blown up in cities like Detroit and Cleveland, and these cities experienced major economic collapse. Lots and houses were abandoned, left empty, and folks who remained struggled to keep up with the cost of food. And so they just started growing it themselves in the empty lots. And neighborhoods that were falling into despair began to revitalize. And so instead of seeing vandalism and fights or drug dealing happening in the empty lots, they became places for good work and friendship and help. And it just made for a rewarding and fruitful atmosphere. But for cities even like Ottawa, there's clear benefits to community gardening. One researcher writes, a recent UK study shows that people who garden for at least 30 minutes a week had lower body mass indexes, as well as higher levels of self-esteem and lower levels of tension and stress. And so there's those therapeutic benefits that someone was mentioning at the beginning. But community gardens also help those who've experienced traumas and displacement. One author writes, shared gardens can be a vehicle for reestablishing a sense of place, building new social ties, and celebrating and maintaining cultural traditions. Urban farms bridge gaps, reduce existing tensions, and foster social integration between otherwise segregated groups. So community gardens have a way of helping to break down cultural divides. They also help break down class divides. Gardens in public and shared spaces allow those who do not otherwise have access to a yard to boost their food security and nutrition. Now, economic benefits. Just by way of example, during World War I and World War II, America had these famous gardens called Victory Gardens. Millions of Americans grew gardens in their backyards, and it provided the nation with 40% of its fruits and vegetables. But that said, the economic benefits or potential economic benefits of urban farming aren't really about competing with large-scale industrial farms. It's more about community gardens providing a alternative source of produce that's healthier and tastier and good for the community. And families can sort of supplement their grocery costs with lower cost produce, or provide supplemental low cost produce for people in need. Now, environmental benefits. When food's grown locally, it just doesn't need to be shipped, which means there's less carbon burned to transport it. And in a similar way, where there's no tractors, there's no diesel burning. Beyond that, sort of carbon footprint stuff, gardens simply help filter air pollution. They also help cool down cities in the summer. And they help retain rainwater that otherwise would run off the lawn and contribute to flooding. So this is all just really basic stuff that I've used really two articles to summarize some of the basics, and grateful to Janet Mark Wallace for helping me with some of this this talk. But you can discover a lot more on your own, far more on your own. What I recommend is you using the streaming service that comes with your Ottawa Public Library card called Canopy. If you just go to the into the documentaries section and go to the science, nature, and technology list, you'll find many documentaries related to community gardening, and I've listed a few there. It's these documentaries, in addition to writings by Wendell Berry, that really inspired me to start wanting to get involved.
He's an environmental theologian.
So that's all for me on the social cultural benefits of urban farming. I'll hand it back to you now, Jeff.
Okay. Just as we hand that back, again, entertaining any questions, hand raised or chatting typing in the chat, or simply raising your hand on the screen. At the moment, I don't see any at this point. So we'll hand it back to Jeff, if that's all right.
But you're muted, Jeff.
Oh, okay. In this next part, I'd like to talk about a few other ideas. And the very last one is something that's quite close to my heart. So hope to encourage you specifically to do that. So I want to talk about growing crops a little bit, crop rotation, and perhaps add a shocker to what I say there. Amending soil, watering, and particularly with regard to using mulch, attracting animals, including pollinators, and then mushrooms in the garden. So growing crops, and perhaps I could start off here by saying that, in fact, the growing of crops is the one thing that's really increasing the community that I experience in Ottawa right now. So I'm in my garden, in one of a couple of places, and people come up to me and say, would you like some seeds? Would you like some transplants? I've met a man from Lebanon, an Eastern European man who's shared both his ideas of how he grows things and some transplants that he gave me, and a Jamaican woman that I found knows the area of Jamaica that I worked in for 6 months a long time ago. So it's a burgeoning area of contact for me, growing of crops. So we normally grow crops by one of two routes, either from seeds or from transplants, and obviously the transplants initially come from the seeds. But I'd like to encourage you to try new varieties. It's quite difficult to do that if you use transplants that you buy from Walmart or Canadian Tire or whatever. But if you go to a nursery, then they tend to have a more extensive line of seeds that have been converted into transplants. Get to know the people who are selling these things to you. If you talk to nursery growers, then next year they might actually grow other things that you've suggested to them. I certainly experienced that in Nova Scotia. Grow your own transplants. Many people do that already. Unfortunately, you need a lot of space or some space with, if you've got animals at home or if you've got young children at home, that's sometimes a problem, but it certainly can still be done if you have the right space. So grow your own if you can. Experiment with timing when you put them out. Everyone seems to be locked into you can't put your tomatoes out until date X, maybe 25th of May, or maybe Victoria Day, or whatever, maybe some day to do with the phases of the moon. But you can cover your transplants with plastic, make low tunnels, as they call them, 2 foot high, 3 foot high spaces that are enclosed with plastic that in fact get quite warm even in coldish days. Join Seeds of Diversity. I'm a great proponent for everyone to join that organization. It's free. They ask you for a donation, but certainly you don't need to make a donation. And by doing that, you get access to, I think I mentioned this to Derwin last year, hundreds of varieties of tomatoes, for example. You have to grow them once you get the seeds, but I mean, they keep for a few years, so you certainly could find or work out that opportunity at a later date. Get to know the seed growers as well. I've actually struck up a couple of friendships, one with a lady in Sudbury who sold me a lot of seeds for this season, and I'll be sharing some of those at the garden. So grow your own seeds into transplants and then plant them in the garden. If you are so inclined, and if you're willing to let some of your produce go to seed itself. So the top right-hand photograph is a photo of one of those yellow cucumbers. Got very wrinkly and dried out on the vine, and there are the seeds which I washed, and I'm going to use those this year.
Hmm.
It's a great opportunity if you have a space to try and get something from your garden that you can then reuse and don't have to buy more seeds. Crop rotation, absolutely key in olden methods of agriculture. It's not really important in gardens, and you might be shocked at me saying that. I'm talking about gardens that are well prepared, have high levels of nutrients. By that I mean enough nutrients for crops to grow. You might worry about diseases, and certainly on an agricultural large field scale, that is important. But if you think about it, if you move your tomatoes 10, 15 feet, maybe 10, 15 yards away, the different pests that you might get, they can hop, jump, or fly that distance anytime they want to. You know, in order to crop rotate on a small garden plot, really you can't do it. You have to have more than one plot in different locations. If you get blight, early blight or late blight, that's going to stick around anyway. You've got to take other action other than just simply moving your crops from one end of your plot to the other.
Dies due to some kind of infection.
So it's a very well talked about, a well understood process, but it really only works on a large scale. I mentioned a little bit about amending soil when I was talking about mulch. But we amend soil with all sorts of different materials. Compost is by far the best that we have available to us now that we don't use synthetic fertilizers. Constant use of compost, 2 to 3 inches a year on top of the soil after your garden is in a state where it can actually grow plants is the best way to go. Let the organisms in the soil mix that in. So for the first couple of years, that won't work. For the first couple of years you of setting up a garden, you have to mix it in yourself, and that has some ramifications, but it tends to work. But once your garden is in operation, so to speak, don't mix it in anymore. Just let the organisms do that for you. It's the same really with blood and bone meal. You can mix them in, but when you do, you start to stir up the structure. You start to change the microorganism content and even the macroorganisms that are there as well. So compost. That's what I would recommend. You can get spent mushroom compost. You can get bags of compost from almost every store. All of the amendments that we use now, so the non-synthetic fertilizer amendments, are very slow release of nutrients. So they won't be fast acting, but once you've got your soil working and you keep adding this every year, you'll be in pretty good shape. One of the big selling features of organic fertilizers in both garden stores and the grocery stores and the larger box stores is that they have a fertilizer for roses and a fertilizer for tomatoes and another fertilizer for greens and so on. Don't be pulled into the idea that you need those different fertilizers. You can use the same one on any crop. What you're really needing to add, if you're adding a fertilizer, is you're needing to add nitrogen. The soils around here have lots of phosphorus, lots of potassium, There are a few places in Canada where you need to add those on a regular basis, but certainly not here. You need sandy soils to have that sort of situation where you need to add them on a regular basis. So if you need to add fertilizer, and you'd probably do that if you get a soil test done, it doesn't really matter which one you use. Some form of N, P, and K would be fine. Preferably higher in N than in P for sure.
Okay.
One of the things I see in, again, almost every store that sells garden material is soil. And that's fine for, putting soil into pots. Usually you need to add vermiculite as well, and that's often there, or in containers. But if you're working with soil in the ground, there's no point adding soil to amend the soil that you have. What you need to do is add compost. Something that someone told me just last week is that they have compost, but it's got lots of weed seeds in it. Don't use it. It's just going to make you a lot more work. So we have some compost at St. Thomas, and we need to compost it some more until we can get rid of those weed seeds. And then the other thing is fresh manure. That used to be used on a regular basis. It certainly should not be used now. It tends to burn crops relatively badly. Not always, but sometimes. Trying to speed up a little bit here now. Watering is really important. Everyone knows that. When you plant seeds, you need to water very well. You need to water transplants very well for the first week or so, almost every day. But on a long-term basis, you should be thinking about deep watering and then letting the soil dry out. So once the season gets going and crops have started and are surviving, particularly if you have mulch, you probably only need to water once or twice a week. It really will cut down on your water needs if you also include mulch in your gardening process.
Yeah, we're watering every day.
Clay soil and sandy soil, people often ask which is the best one. From water point of view, they're both pretty bad, and they can both be improved by adding compost to them. So if you have a clay soil, a lot of the soil around here is quite clayey. If you add compost to it, if you add and then use mulch, then you'll slowly break down the clay particles, and it will be better for water, and water will penetrate more easily. Sandy soil tends to let water run right through it. If you add compost and mulch it, then that will tend to retain water much better. So watering, I think we water too much typically, and we need to think more about how we can perhaps reduce that somewhat. Last couple of slides on attracting animals and then pollinators, and then on this last one on mushrooms. So all of these pictures here, the goldfinch, basically the house for attracting different bees and wasps. My third picture here is supposed to be a rabbit. I don't know what happened to it, and then a squirrel. So gardens attract all of these things. They attract birds. Sit in your garden for any length of time, and you'll see birds, and you can enjoy the garden just for the birds that come to visit. You need to feed them. Be very careful. If you feed thistle seed to goldfinches, then all that seed that drops on the ground, anyone who does this has seen it happen, will start to grow thistles. And so that could become a problem. The bee houses, wasp and bee houses that are around, you see this one is very close to the trees. If you don't put it close to the trees, the wasps and bees tend not to congregate in those structures. So placement is very important. And obviously, if you have crops that squirrels or rabbits or whatever other small mammals like, if you have those in your garden, those mammals, and you can enjoy them as well. Pollinators, and here are 4 types. So mason bee, hummingbird, wasp, and a butterfly are again all things that are attracted to gardens that have the right plants, have the right structures in them. And so I would encourage you all to grow plants that attract them. They're great to talk about. They get great to watch. Just a fantastic addition to your garden. And then finally, mushrooms. You often find mushrooms growing by accident in gardens, particularly in damp, darkish areas. But one of the newer practices now is to actually grow mushrooms as a crop. And in particular in North America, in northern North America anyway, wine cap mushrooms are the mushroom of choice. They grow in woodchip paths that many of you have in your gardens. You can utilize the shade, and like I say, the damp sort of shady areas. All you need to do is scatter mushroom spawn onto the paths, and within a few months, you should expect to get mushrooms. And I guess my caveat here in red, bolded almost, is please don't eat anything unless you know what it is. So obviously before you start this, you need to be able to, look at photographs, look perhaps at actual mushrooms and identify them. Most people who eat mushrooms only eat 3 or 4 different varieties of mushroom that they know 100% for certain. So chanterelles, for example, field mushrooms, just the regular mushroom, might be one, and certainly this wine cap mushroom would be one that I would eat once I've seen it and it's got the right colored gills and the right type of cap, and it's grown in the right place and so on. So that's where I end, and hopefully I've provided you some more useful information. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them as I pass the screen back to Tom.
Just in passing, Janet Mark-Wallace has raised a question for Tom, which is where you get your Wendell Berry literature. Is there a good collection of it at the public library? And indeed, are the works still in publication? You can either answer that now or maybe separately follow that up with Janet.
Oh, sure. I might as well answer it now in case. Have folks heard of Wendell Berry before? Sort of show of hands. Yeah. I haven't seen his books at the Ottawa Public Library. All those works are still in publication. He's hugely popular. What I recommend is getting your hands on his volume of essays. It's just called Wendell Berry Essays. It's published by the Library of America editions. It's really beautiful copies, and it is essays he wrote from, what is it, 1993 to 2017. Actually, no, it's way earlier than that. It's like I think that's the second volume. The first volume starts in the 60s. But he does a really amazing job of, I guess, inspiring a return to a sort of a simple, small scale approach to growing food and finding one's place. He's from Kentucky. He was sort of a literary guy, poet, scholar, philosopher, and felt a strong passion, you could say calling, to return to his home farm where his family was. and to start a small scale farm there. So there's poetry, there's novels, and there's essays. For the kind of stuff we're talking about today, I highly recommend reading some of his essays.
Perfect.
So maybe I could just add to that. It seems I didn't know, Janet, that you liked him as well, but Tom and I seem to have a common interest. I've got, I believe, 6 books by him, a couple of novels. So we'll talk later, Janet. But
Okay.
he is a great author, and someone that he's a little difficult to read, I think, but someone that everyone, if they have time, should read.
He gets quoted all the time by other people. That's why but he's
Yeah.
a little hard to find his actual works. So, okay, I'm definitely going to borrow those from you, Jeff. Thanks.
I find bookstores, especially Indigo, is so useless for really good books. But all this stuff is available online, Indigo Books or Amazon if you're okay with using Amazon. I also have the 2-volume set of his essays, so happy to lend that if you'd like. He's exciting for he's very eloquent, but he's a powerful polemicist. He can make an argument and just kind of hit you in the gut. And he's one of those writers where you might think, I don't know if he's right, but it really sounds right.
Okay. Thank you for the question. Tom, I think you're next up as a speaker.
Okay, Jeff, do you have a third section or was that it? Okay, well, I'll sort of some concluding remarks here and then open it up for questions and further discussion and connection. So this, just to conclude on that point, connection. Community gardening is a place to connect with the earth, with other creatures, and with the Creator who sustains all things. A greater sense of connection is one of the main things urban gardeners and small-scale farmers love to talk about. Gardening is a way to literally come back down to earth, to return to the earth we were metaphorically molded from, and to which we will return when we die. By gardening, people learn what goes into the growth of food. Gardeners see both the difficulty and the wonderful ease of making things grow. Gardeners discover a connection with the seasons. They learn to recognize what times of year are for planting, for tending, for reaping. All of a sudden, the weather matters so much more. The year takes on new layers of anticipation and hope, reflection and learning. And then complex systems that Jeff's been exploring for us, systems of soil and insects and seeds, water, sunlight, and community can all be fully appreciated. There's an author who writes, spend a few months taking a broccoli from seed to harvest, and you'll soon have a much deeper appreciation for the natural systems on which we depend. Our connection to the earth becomes gobsmackingly obvious when you watch the crops grow or fail. And the point I want to stress is that rediscovering or discovering this sense of connection is a rediscovery of what the scriptures describe as the very kind of fellowship for which we and all things were created. Community gardening is one way for us to reconnect with our identities as creatures. You could even say animals. And by getting down in the dirt, and by coming together as community, by sharing knowledge, by gathering the produce of the earth, we struggle together, enjoy time together, appreciate the creation we live in. It helps us to become more ourselves as earthlings And by becoming more ourselves, become closer to the God who made us to be ourselves. By showing up at the garden and saying, here I am, ready to make things grow or help things grow, we're responding to God's call, let there be. Our hands and feet at work are acts of praise to God. Like Psalm 19 says, there is no speech, nor are there words. But all that happens in the garden is worship. Because it's a choice to live on the earth, not like it's a battleground for riches, but a good gift for fellowship with each other, with other creatures, and with our Creator. And that's all.
That's great. Thank you very, very much, Tom. That's a very appropriate final sort of formal presentation. There's a few folks who are clapping, and I'll echo that. That's great. And I guess at this point we do have a few minutes before whatever closing remarks would be even useful at this point. If there are any outstanding questions, comments from around the room, it's certainly timely to do that, and we have a few minutes. We've got until our scheduled ending around 8:30, and so I'd welcome anything further before I just take 30 seconds and sort of end the event. Is there anything anybody else would like to add? I think Jim Doherty has a question.
Jim, Heather, and Anne. So we got a few.
It was just a comment about the trees at St. Thomas. How about the pine trees? I guess they would be of no use to be mulched.
Actually, I may just get in ahead of Jeff on this. Jeff, I believe that you used pine cones last year around your plots, and I'd be interested if you'd comment on the purpose and effectiveness of that.
Sure. So pine needles are great as a mulch. You usually have to put 3 or 4 inches rather than the 2 to 3. So a little deeper. But pine cones actually seem to work to dissuade small mammals from running across a garden plot. Yeah, you're right, though. And I collected bags of them from under the trees there, and I just distributed it all over one of my plots anyway. And they seem to work. I didn't seem to get as much digging as some other people did. Of course, you need to be very careful when you say something like that, because it's not really a scientific study. But it certainly seems to work, and pine cones also act as a not very good mulch, but they certainly cover some of the soil. Yeah, so pine trees are as useful as trees that have regular types, the deciduous trees that have leaves.
I'm not sure, actually. Jim wanted to know that, because it means that when we do the garden cleanup next year, a separate step in the garden cleanup will be assembling all the pine cones and keeping them separate and putting them on the garden. Jim, did you want to know that? Maybe you can talk offline about this, but anyway, but it's helpful to know how the pine cones work in that context. That's great. There was another question, I think, raised. Anne, I think you had a question here.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you? Okay. It's an article that I have, and it's not strictly related to community gardens, but gardens in general. And the article was "Are Gardens Art?" And in it, I should quote to you, which I think you might appreciate. From Shakespeare to Kipling, all the great poets have celebrated gardens as the nearest thing on earth to heaven itself. And I thought that was rather nice. And then to follow up on what it's really something that our Tom has, Reverend Tom, I like to call you the Reverend Tom, said, only in their gardens are they taken out of themselves, beyond themselves, above themselves in their earthly paradise. Anyway, this is all an article that I have kept for years. And I grew up on a farm in Scotland, a mixed farm, arable farm, in the Strathmore Valley, which is very wonderful farming land. So from an early age, I mean, gardens were part of life. And here now, we're not so much into vegetable and other gardening, but we're interested in gardening as beauty and art. And we rather enjoy that, and the birds, and we have a lot of plants that attract pollinators, and you know, sedums and black-eyed Susans, and oh my goodness knows what else. But anyway, that's just my little comment. But it's been very interesting, you know, both talks, and thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for that very, very complimentary comment. That's terrific. I just add, as we go through, we discovered last year there are a couple of wild animals that I think we would probably say are not so welcome on the garden.
I know what's coming.
And so I'm thinking in particular about bunnies and raccoons.
Yes, yes.
We had a wonderful time with them last year. And we discovered that raccoons love corn on the cob, and that the corn that we grew just basically evaporated overnight one night. But we'll work on that this year. There were other questions. I think Heather, you had a question.
If we're talking quotes, he who makes a garden walks hand in hand with God is the one I know. My question is not exactly a question. A long time ago, my mother was a gardener, and we had a victory garden during the war, and I hated working in that garden. It was so hot, and I had to wear this horrible bonnet and everything. But a doctor told my mother that working in the soil meant that you restored, I don't really understand this, you restored the positive ions or the negative ions or whatever the ions are, that you got your body physically back in balance because of the ionization of the soil. So I obviously am not a scientist. Does anybody know anything about the scientificness of actually getting our hands in soil and how that might balance us? Is anybody?
That's certainly outside my field, I'm afraid.
Okay, so nobody. All right, well, maybe I'll look it up after this. On that.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Heather. Any other questions at this point for Tom and Jeff? In which case, Dan, do you have another point?
It's not a question. It's probably not the nicest thing to end on, but why do so many people in Canada call the soil dirt? It has
There's a worse name than dirt. Starts with an S.
Missed that, Jim. I'm sorry.
Well, it's better than another word we could use that starts with an S.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if that's an appropriate note to end on, but anyway.
Now we make it something about manure, but as long as it's not fresh manure, it needs time to decompose a little bit.
Okay, got it. Okay. I'm gonna if there are no more questions or comments, then I'm gonna sorry, Maura, do you have a question? Maura?
I'm just going to make a comment because talk of manure, and I thought, should I mention it? Oh, well, I will anyway. as a young woman, my father was stationed in northern Germany. We lived in the north of Germany, and I used to cycle to work every day through the fields. And this is now I'm talking late 50s, okay? And in the spring there'd be gangs of men or prisoners being directed by the farmer, hand spreading muck onto the fields. And you could smell it for miles. And when you were talking about manure, that brought that memory back to me. I don't know why. I haven't thought about it for years, but it brought it back to me.
And it's a good memory.
Yeah. Well, not for the prisoners, maybe, but
But for us who still smell it.
And probably after that, you probably could smell those men from miles.
oh, more than likely.
Okay, well, thank you for that, that little vignette there, Mara. Thank you. That's
Sorry.
good.
Thank you
not to worry.
both. Thank you all very much for putting this on. My sister told me about it, and I thought, oh, it sounds interesting. And it's been very fascinating and informative, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Well, that's good. Thank you. Thank you very much. On behalf of all of us, I'm going to thank Tom and Jeff for doing the work that quite extensive work, obviously, as you've seen, for putting this together, coming up with the remarks and the slides and so on and so forth. And I have to tell you, the two of them spent, I'm thinking probably, what is it, folks, 2 or 3 hours this afternoon sorting out the handing off of the mic back and forth to each other and how that would work with the slides. This was not a trivial undertaking, and I was there to watch it. And they worked very hard on that. So thanks much more for what sort of passed underneath the surface here to Jeff and Tom. There's a lot of work that's gone into this. And thank you to all of you who joined us for this event. And I've been watching the numbers, and nobody left. And I thought that was impressive. Usually, yeah, in these things, you get maybe a little bit of trickling off. Nobody left, and that's impressive and so good. And I'll finally mention, as we did at the beginning, that the event has been recorded and will be available on the parish's YouTube channel, which is accessible through the parish website. Tom, you've got that memorized, stthomasaltavista.com. Sorry,
The website, St. Thomas Parish, Ottawa.
Okay, sorry. Okay. And finally, at the beginning on the chat, I put down my email address. The slides that Tom and Jeff have used, I will have those, and we'll be able to share those back with you if you'd like to gain access to them offline, clearly. But my email is at the very top of the chat function, and is there for further reference. So at the risk of talking too long, I'll say again, thank you very much all for coming. Thank you again to Tom and Jeff for this. There's a lot of clapping going on, muted or not, in the background, and that's a great vote of confidence. So I'll end it for now. Thank you all, and if you have any other comments that you'd like to share with me on my send me an email, and I'll pass that on to Jeff and Tom. So thank you all very much.
Thanks for coming,
Thanks.
everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.